Most businesses we deal with are concerned about cash flow and, more specifically, the proper price point for their product. How do we calculate that proper price point? One word: break even. In today's video, we're going to go over what is break even, how do you calculate it, and why is it important to your business. Stay tuned. What is break even? Now, there are many resources and methods and formulas on the internet, and some of them are very complex. Whatever method or resource you use, it's important to understand the overall concept of what break even truly is. In a most simplistic way, break even really is sales minus your cost of goods sold minus your operating expenses equals zero. That truly is what break even is. And that concept is important to know when you start getting into break even, because like I said, there's some very complex formulas out there and they do work. It's just you need to understand the cost benefit ratio of which method you want to use and what you're ultimately trying to accomplish. And in reality, you want to make sure your sales cover your expenses and you eventually get net income. Now we need to go into some important terms. These terms will come up as we start going through this video, and it's easier to get these out of the way first so you have kind of an understanding as we start working through formulas. First item is gross margin. Gross margin truly is sales minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. So in other words, some of you have heard of gross profit, gross margin. They intertwine with one another. Also, there's cost of goods sold. And cost of goods sold is materials, labor, and overhead. Those are the three main categories that represent cost of goods sold. Variable costs. Now, variable costs are costs that go up and down in relation to sales and or volume of products that have gone out the door. Fixed costs. Fixed costs are costs that stay the same no matter how much sales you actually have go out the door. Contribution margin. Contribution margin is sales less variable costs equal contribution margin. This is an important concept to know because one of the formulas we work with is going to go over what the contribution margin is and, more specifically, what the contribution margin percent is. So how do we calculate break even? First, let's do a very high level calculation. Now this calculation is very simplistic, but it actually is a very powerful analysis tool.
So in this example, we're going to go over one of the more high level and more simplistic ways to determine the break-even point for your company. And in this method, we're going to use the general administrative expenses to determine the break-even point. Now, we just recently went over the cost of goods sold and how that affects your overall income statement, how it affects your break-even, your gross margin. But the general administrative expenses, which are your admin expenses, your selling expenses, and your facility expenses, these expenses actually will dictate what your break-even should be in a percentage. So as you can see, we've gone through and done a calculation of manufacturing company, and we've done a calculation of all the major categories as a percent of sales. So we can see in this example, manufacturing company has a division for steel, polymer, and glass. And each of those represent 8% of the total sales. Same thing with cost of goods sold. That represents this percent of total sales. And then, of course, as we mentioned, this comes down to our gross margin. Sales less cost of goods sold equals our gross margin. Now, down here, you can see we have our admin, selling, and facility expenses. These are more or less known as our general administrative costs. Well, we can take a percent of these general administrative costs as a percentage of sales and determine what our break-even really should be. In a nutshell, we're going to use this percentage right here to observe what we need our products, and more specifically each division, to equal for a gross margin percent. So one thing you can deduce from looking at this chart or this financial statement is general and administrative expenses equals 10.5% of sales. So if you think about this another way, your gross margin, this number right here, should at least equal 10.5% of sales. So we know that in order to cover our G&A expenses, our margin needs to be at least 10.5%. So if our gross margin is 10.5%, then we know we're covering all these administrative, selling, and facility expenses. So now that we know our general administrative expenses are 10.5% of sales, we can take that information and break it down by each of these respective divisions in our sample company. As you can see in this sample, we can see that steel represents 625,000 of sales, 216 of cost of goods sold, a gross margin of 408,000, but the gross margin of steel is 65.3. On polymer, again, we can see our sales, our cost of goods sold, our margin, but our gross margin percent is 22.5. Both of those are above our 10.5% on our G&A. Now we get to the glass division. As we can see here, the glass division's gross margin percent of 7.2 is lower than the 10.5 for the G&A expenses. So as a whole, that's telling us that the glass division is actually losing us money, and the steel and polymer division are actually bringing up that respective division. So now that we have this data available to us, we can then go through and start looking at the glass division to see, one, are we putting in the right cost of goods sold into the glass division? We may have costs in there that should be on the steel side, but we now have that data, we have that roadmap to know where we need to go to look at it. So after we look at it, if we see that all the costs going into glass are exactly what they should be for the glass division and all the sales are there, then that can tell us that we either, one, need to increase the price of the glass division, the respective products in there, or two, we may need even to abandon the glass division. Now there could be nuances that the steel division, when people order steel, they also get some of the glass, and given steel has a 65% gross margin percent, we may be willing to accept that. But at least we know which division is actually costing us money based on our overall analysis. And again, you can break this down even further on the sales side. So we may have 1,000 SKUs underneath the glass division. We can break down each one of those SKUs the same method and say which SKU is coming out less than 10.5%. We could have very well 3 or 4 SKUs in there that are just complete dogs that are 0% or even negative, that we can either jack the price up on those or just get rid of them. And then in essence, it'll make the whole glass division go up. But again, we need to be able to do a very high level and simplistic calculation first to determine where we need to focus our attention as we go through this process.
Now that we've gone over kind of a high-level simplistic calculation, let's go into a more detailed calculation. This calculation deals with using fixed costs divided by contribution margin percentage.
If we use our example of our sample company that we did previously in the general and administrative area, we can see how the detailed calculation of the fixed cost divided by contribution margin shows up and how it really affects the financial statements. So here we have the financial statements that we previously used in the G&A example, and we're going to back in and calculate what the break-even number is in sales for the manufacturing company. Now in our example, we are going to assume that all the cost of sales right here are actually variable costs. For simplicity purposes, in this example, we'll assume that a lot of times you'll have fixed costs built into the cost of sales, but for our example, we're just going to assume they're all variable costs. So here we have our total sales, and our variable costs comes down to our contribution margin. And now we need to determine what our contribution margin percent. This number right here, this 41.3, is just a simple division of 504,000, our contribution margin, divided into the sales of 1.2 million. So now we have our contribution margin of 41.3%. Now, again, to keep this example simplistic, we're going to assume all our G&A costs are fixed. A lot of times your G&A costs act almost as if fixed costs, so for this example we're just going to assume they're all fixed. So going back to the formula, if you recall, fixed cost divided by contribution margin percent will determine what your break-even number is in sales. So in this example, here we have $128,721 of fixed costs divided by our contribution margin of 41.3%. Tells us our break-even in sales should be $311,673. So now let's go ahead and prove that. So we're going to override all these sales numbers up here, and we're just going to assume the steel division was the only division that had sales, and it had a sales of 311,000. So as we put our numbers in here, we'll come in here and say, here's our $311,673 of sales, and we're going to say there's 0 in polymer and 0 in glass. As you can see, down here in the net income area, our net income is equal to 0, which again, that's how this formula works. And this is a very detailed calculation. However, one of the problems with this formula is you have to do this on every single product, or at least every single division, and assume you have all the fixed costs associated with each division properly broke out. So there is a weakness to this. This is probably the most accurate calculation that you can get to break even, but again, there are certain weaknesses in this.
Now that we've gone over these methods, let's look at what some of the weaknesses are on these methods. Now, the G&A cost as a percent of sales is a very high level calculation, and it allows you to zero in on areas that you need to look at, whether it's division or even product. However, the weakness with this particular calculation is it doesn't get you to absolute zero. It gives you kind of a range and an area to focus on, but it doesn't get you to absolute zero. The fixed cost divided by the contribution margin, this formula, while it does get you to absolute zero, the weakness with this particular method is you have to do it on each division and each product. And within those calculations, you need to know what the fixed costs are on each division and more specifically, each product. So you start getting down to that level and you have to do a lot more detailed calculation. So again, we have weaknesses on both of them, and it really is dependent on your business on how much specific detail you need, or are you good enough with just kind of doing a high level calculation. It's also important to note that you need to do this calculation at least monthly. This is not one of those formulas, regardless of what method you use, that you just do a one and done calculation and use that number throughout the year. Reason being is your costs go up and down throughout the year. Usually they're going to go up. More specifically, you have a vendor that has a price increase. Well, if their price increase was after the last time you did your calculation, well, your break-even point has now changed. Also, you have sales fluctuations. You may have a product mix where you're producing a more profitable product during certain times of the month and less profitable products during other times of the month. Again, your break-even points change. And so you want to do this calculation each month and start developing a range, as to what is really my break-even point. Case in point, you may be a manufacturing company and you may have a break-even point in March of say $800,000. Then in April, it may be $750,000. And then after that, maybe it's $900,000. You just want to start developing that range to understand this is kind of the range I have. Then from there, you can start saying, okay, if my break-even point went so much lower in a month, why did it go lower? Well, odds are is you probably were selling more profitable products at that point in time. So again, don't just do one calculation for your break-even and then assume that's the correct number for the whole year. Those numbers change. You're going to have increases in, say, payroll. You may have cost of living or normal raises. Or you could very well have a vendor price increase each month for different vendors. As you go through, if you're not increasing your sales to compensate for that, your break-even point is changing. So keep that in mind as you're going through this process. Now, why is all this important? Well, obviously it's important because of cash flow, but more particular, it's important because of cash flow from operations. So you may be selling a product and you're bringing in the sales and you're bringing in the cash from it, and that is technically cash inflow. However, we need to understand, is that cash covering the expenses? And thus the concept cash from operations. So if you have your financial statements, your core financial statements are going to be your income statement, your balance sheet, and your statement of cash flows. On the statement of cash flows, that line item says cash from operations. That has got to be one of the most important numbers for your entire business. If that is negative, kind of gives you an idea, maybe your break-even point, you're not quite hitting that break-even point. Now, there could be other items going through there, but generally that's what we would want to look at. Next item for why break-even is important is you want to determine what your profitability is, and can you increase the price of your product? Will the market allow you to do that? So when you see your break-even point and you start seeing here's your sales, if you compare that to your industry or benchmark, you may have an opportunity to increase the sales price. Or conversely, you may want to eliminate that product if you can't increase that sales price. And then the last item, the break-even point calculation is important because it helps eliminate that mentality of I will make it up on volume. We've all seen that situation where an individual is losing money and they have that thought process, well, I'll just make it up on volume, getting more product out the door. If you're losing money on one product, it doesn't matter if you sell another 100,000, it's not going to matter because you're just going to lose more money per product. So that's why it's important for us to understand the break-even point, where we need to be, whether you're going to do an absolute calculation to get to absolute zero, or you're going to do a G&A to sales calculation so you know what your gross margin percent should be. I hope this video was very helpful for you and gave you and your business some ideas on where to focus on doing your break-even calculations. If you like this video, please hit subscribe. We'll be releasing more videos in the next weeks and months to come. And if there's a specific topic you want us to cover, please put it in the comment sections and we'll try to release a video on those respective topics.